Right, let's just dive straight into a topic that's been absolutely dominating the news lately. We're going to bypass all that political noise and just look at the facts. Today, we're unpacking the Waqf Board. It's one of those subjects sparking intense debates everywhere, but, often without the context we actually need. So my goal for this explainer is to really break down the reality of what it is, how it works, and why it's suddenly at the center of such a massive national conversation.
To really grasp the huge debate around the Indian government's proposed 2024 amendment bill, we can't just skim the headlines. We've got to dig a little deeper. We need to look at the history, the actual legal mechanics of how these boards function, and, perhaps most importantly, the hard data regarding the staggering amount of property they manage.
To get there, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with what a Waqf actually is, trace its history in India, map out the modern legal framework, dive into the economics and the issues of mismanagement, and finally, we'll break down that 2024 amendment bill.
All right, part one. What exactly is a Waqf? At the very heart of this is the core Islamic concept of sadaqah jariyah. Think of it as a continuous flowing charity. Imagine taking a piece of property and, rather than just donating it once, you permanently dedicate it in the name of Allah for public welfare. We're talking about things like building mosques, setting up orphanages, or providing rest stops for travelers. The absolutely crucial thing to understand here is that once a property is designated as Waqf, its ownership permanently shifts. It belongs to Allah. That means, legally, it can never be sold, it can never be gifted, and it cannot be inherited. In fact, the Supreme Court of India put it perfectly: once a Waqf, always a Waqf.
Okay, moving on to part two, the history of Waqf in India. So, how did this Middle Eastern tradition evolve on the Indian subcontinent? Historically, setting up a Waqf was a huge, widespread practice fully supported by Islamic empires like the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals. Rulers would literally attach entire surrounding villages to mosques just to create a self-sustaining financial loop. But here's a really fascinating detail. It wasn't just Islamic rulers doing this. To maintain social harmony, Hindu rulers were totally on board too. For example, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj actually donated over 650 acres of land for a dargah and a mosque. It was really a shared cross-cultural tradition of maintaining charitable sites.
Well, that shared tradition hit a massive roadblock when British colonial rule began. The British started introducing new laws, like the Transfer of Property Act in 1882 and the Land Acquisition Act in 1894. These laws basically allowed the government to acquire any land for public projects. And you can see the problem, right? That directly clashed with the core Waqf rule that these properties literally couldn't be sold or transferred to anyone. This led to decades of intense protests from the Muslim community, until finally, in 1923, the British backed down a bit and provided formal legal recognition with the Muslim and Waqf Act.
Which brings us to part three, the modern legal framework.
After independence, the Indian government had the monumental task of organizing these vast, scattered properties into one cohesive system. So they built a strict hierarchy. Right at the very top, you've got the Central Waqf Council, which sits under the Ministry of Minority Affairs. Step down one level, and you have the state Waqf boards. Think the UP Waqf Board or the Gujarat Waqf Board. Below them are the district committees. And finally, right down at the ground level, you have the mutawalis. Basically, a mutawali is the local manager or caretaker of a specific piece of Waqf property.
Now, I want you to really pay attention to this next concept because it is at the center of so much debate today. It's a legal definition called Waqf by user. Formalized over time, this rule means that if a property has been historically used for Islamic religious purposes, like, say, people have just been gathering to pray in a specific spot for decades, it is legally considered a Waqf, even if there isn't a single scrap of ancient paper or a written deed proving it. Now, you can see why this was incredibly important for ancient properties that simply lost their paperwork over centuries, but it also cracked the door wide open for some incredibly complex legal disputes.
To try and streamline all those disputes, the government rolled out the 1995 Waqf Act. And wow, did this vastly increase the power of Waqf boards. It created these fast-track Waqf tribunals to handle cases quickly and bypass those hopelessly clogged civil courts. But here's the kicker. The judgments from these tribunals were essentially final. You couldn't challenge them in regular courts. On top of that, Section 40 of this act introduced a massive legal shift. Just imagine someone claiming they own your house, but the law says the burden of proof is entirely on you to prove it's yours, rather than on them to prove their claim. That is essentially the kind of power this act handed to the Waqf boards.
All right, let's get into part 4, economics and mismanagement. This is probably the most critical part of our whole explainer, brought to light by the famous 2006 Satcher Committee report. The sheer scale of what we're talking about is honestly hard to wrap your head around. According to that committee, Waqf boards control roughly 6 lakh, that's 600,000 acres of land across India. To put a price tag on that, the market value of those properties was estimated at well over 1.2 lakh crores. They are literally one of the largest landholders in the entire country.
But, and this is a massive but, a really stark contrast emerges when you look at the revenue. Just consider this comparison. Singapore manages a tiny portfolio of just 200 Waqf properties, right? But they generate about 42.7 crore rupees in revenue from them. Meanwhile, India, sitting on around 490,000 registered properties at the time of the report, managed to generate a grand total of just 163 crore rupees.
The Soccer Committee absolutely hammered on this massive shortfall. They did the math and estimated that even with a super conservative 10% return on the property values, the Waqf should be pulling in about 12,000 crores every single year for the welfare of the community. Instead, they were reporting 163 crores. That is a mind-boggling gap. Literally billions of rupees meant to alleviate poverty and uplift the community were just vanishing into thin air.
So naturally you have to ask, where on earth is all that money going? Well, investigations revealed some deeply systemic corruption. We're talking about caretakers, local land mafias, and politicians siphoning off the value of these lands. There were reports of Waqf properties, which, remember, are strictly meant for religious charity, being leased out for alcohol businesses, which is completely forbidden in Islam. Over in Karnataka, one report alleged that a nexus of politicians and mafias illegally sold off 27,000 acres of Waqf land. In prime areas of Delhi, highly valuable properties were somehow being rented out for literal pennies, like 1 to 11 rupees a month. There were even crazy instances of people building fake dargahs out in state forests just to illegally claim the land.
To try and get a handle on this absolute mess, the government launched the WAMSI online portal to digitize records. Right now, there are over 58,000 registered complaints of mismanagement on there, but here is the most telling and honestly tragic statistic. Nearly 10,000 of those cases were filed by Muslims themselves against the Waqf boards. The very community that this continuous charity was actually designed to protect and uplift is the one suffering the most from its deep-rooted mismanagement.
And that leads us straight into our final section, Part 5, the 2024 Amendment Bill.
Looking at all that data, the government's latest legislative response is this new 2024 bill, and it proposes some truly sweeping administrative changes. For starters, it completely scraps that Waqf by user rule we talked about earlier. Moving forward, only properties with formal, written deeds would be considered valid. It also takes the power to survey land away from Waqf commissioners and hands it over to government district collectors. Plus, it makes it mandatory to include non-Muslims and Muslim women on these boards, it hands all the financial audits over to the CAG, and it replaces the Muslim law expert in the tribunals with a state government officer.
As you can imagine, this has created a massive divide across the country, and we need to look at both sides objectively here. On one side, proponents of the bill say, hey, these are absolutely crucial steps to force administrative transparency, break up those land mafias, and stop the systemic corruption that's been robbing the community for decades. On the flip side, the Muslim community and opponents of the bill have some very real, very deep trust issues with this. They look at these changes, especially the part about bringing government collectors and non-Muslims into Waqf affairs, as a massive state overreach. They fear it's a move designed to strip a minority religious institution of its autonomy and potentially seize its historic lands.
And that brings us to the ultimate crossroads. As this bill gets hotly debated in Parliament and in living rooms across the nation, this is the crucial question we all have to think about regarding the future of those 6 lakh acres. How does a modern democracy actually balance preserving a beautiful 1,400-year-old tradition of continuous charity with the absolutely urgent need to enforce modern administrative transparency and stop corruption? It is a highly complex issue, but I really hope this explainer has given you the clear, objective facts you need to see the reality behind all the screaming headlines. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this, and I will catch you in the next explainer.